Right. 1952, Surrey against in India. Not the best of times for Tony Locke, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's right. He got called for throwing, and of course there was always this sort of implication that he had a bent arm at times when he came in with a faster ball. And finally, he was called in that match, and there was, as far as the 1950s, had crowd disturbances in English county cricket, which was a fairly gentle sort of demonstration. People were not happy. Some of the crowd, I think, were slow hand clapping and booing the umpire. And it just so happens that it was July of '52. And if I may briefly cross-reference another character you mentioned in the book, it was the 9th birthday of the young Mick Jagger, as he was then called. And he went up to the Oval with his father, Joe, and who was a great cricket man, a nice guy, very nice guy, Joe. And they were there to witness this sort of semi-historic event of Tony being no-balled for throwing twice. And as a result of that, he didn't change his action at all, but I think he took a break that afternoon. And it all sort of came about when another 6 years, I think, went by. And I'm jumping ahead, but it was in Australia, 58, 59. And he saw a video, a very sort of crude or film footage, Super 8, sort of cine film footage of his action. And he said he was so horrified. Tony said he was so horrified. It was the first time he'd seen himself in slow motion accurately. And he clearly did have a bent elbow for some of his deliveries. And to his credit, he went back to the indoor school, or an indoor school at the Oval, and spent about 6 weeks working out a new form of delivery. So as a result of that, he came back for a sort of another phase of his career that lasted throughout the 60s, but a slightly different bowler than he'd been maybe at his prime earlier on, but more legitimate bowler, but perhaps less destructive. But yeah, I'm sorry, that was all. 52 was a sort of crisis point in that he was called, and he was again called 18 months later in the West Indies when he went out with Len Hutton's MCC team on what turned out to have been a fairly controversial tour for other reasons. And he was called once there as well. So yeah, there were people who noticed it. But Mickey Stewart told me that in those days, it was altogether different. The whole idea of throwing was not as, obviously there wasn't technology that could analyze and pinpoint these things as clearly as today. But he said people would just sort of nudge each other on the field and say, "Oh, Tony, that one looked a bit dodgy, didn't it?" And no one really was as fussed about it as they might be today. And it was a sort of joke almost within the county circuit that, Tony would ping one in, as he put it, every now and then, and ping he did. So that was pretty much, but I don't think he did it. He did not do it, in fact, every delivery, far from it. So it wasn't like he was blatantly chucking away six balls and over, but there were some that were dodgy, definitely.
Jim Laker was an interesting character. He comes across as quiet and droll and deferential. Yet he had a very radical streak, didn't he? And these were in the years while there was amateurs and professionals. We talked about 1948, obviously 1956, that the highlight. But after then, it went down in certain direction, didn't it? And culminated in his book when he was looking back on his career. Although it struck me, as you point out, when he was asked about the book, he said, "Well, I haven't actually read the book yet." Obviously, it was Ghost written. There doesn't seem to have been very much of a dialogue between Ghost and subject.
Yeah, there is a photo in my book somewhere of him holding. We can at least say he read it after it was published, because there's a picture of him And he doesn't look, I might add, as though he's greatly enjoying. I mean, he's sort of scowling as he reads it. So it might be some of the phrasing was coming to him only then for the first time. He certainly didn't sit down and write it in the sense of laboring over every word as some of us have done, you know, and agonizing. I think it was presented to him and he probably glanced at it and it was published. But it was unfortunate. There was some score settling was going on there. And one of the scores he had, I don't think it's shockingly revealing to say that he and Peter May had a fractious relationship at times. Now, part of Laker's upbringing that we touched on, and also his experience in the army, where he was a private soldier, I think gave him a lifelong, you could say, chip on his shoulder, but a lifelong sense that, you know, it was us and them, and social divide, which of course in cricket in the 50s was much more pronounced than it is now. And he was a player and not a gentleman, and he felt this very keenly throughout his career, that he was a sort of useful servant to the teams he played in, but never more than a servant. And I think that ate away at him. And you know, he told me as much, you know, in several conversations. So I'm not totally speculating, but there's lots of evidence that he felt that way. And the book was really that climax of that feeling. He was angry at Peter May, among others, because he thought Peter May, rightly or wrongly, epitomized the sort of public school, privileged sort of all came too easily, and he was part of a sort of establishment that he, Jim, was not part of, and that this had sort of grated on him, and he settled a few scores in that book. But you know, as usual on these occasions, there's the big picture, if you will, of the class antagonism and the sense that he was being badly treated, and then there's the sort of specific smaller picture, and you know, the trigger, if you will. The trigger for Laker's real displeasure against Peter May, and that came out in his book, was that May, Locke, and Laker, three Surrey players, had been leaving the ground. Could it have been Headingley? But anyway, it was a test match, 1958, towards the end of the summer, and they were heading back to London together, which makes sense. They were all going to the same, you know, area. And it was the end of the test. The car broke down somewhere in the backwoods of, I think it was Cheshire, but it was rural England, northern England. The car broke down. Now, May got out of the car and he said, I have to be in London tomorrow morning. You know, I'm captain of England. I've got a press conference. I've got to do this and this. I'll take the train. You know, somehow they managed to get a taxi for May, pre-mobile phone days, but somehow they did. They flagged someone down, I suppose. Peter May, in other words, swanned off on the train back to London, leaving his county teammates in the gathering dusk by a broken down car in this rural village, and you know, said more or less, you blokes are on your own. You know, get back to London as best you can. I'll see you when I see you, but I'm off. And this really annoyed Laker. I mean, it's not a much publicized event, but it really irritated Jim Laker that May had sort of abandoned him as he saw it, you know, by the side of the road. And when he met May a couple of days later, having managed to get back to the Oval, sparks flew. And, you know, Laker said, you know, that was high-handed, or probably blunter than that. That was, you know, unnecessary. And you left me standing there. And one or two other things were going on as well. And the result of this sort of cumulative rage on Laker's part was he said, I'm not bloody going to Australia this winter if you're captain. I'm not going to do it. And he stormed into the Surrey secretary's office and made this dramatic statement. And I think, rather to his surprise, the Surrey secretary, Colonel Babb by name, promptly picked up the phone and rang Hamish Aird, Ronnie Aird, the MCC, and said, by the way, Laker will not be available this winter. He's just told me, and put the phone down. And I don't think Jim was quite ready for that conversation to take place. He
Yeah.
was venting rather than actually making a formal statement of non-availability. And I think the Surrey secretary's actions sort of took him by surprise. So now he's standing there, he can't go to Australia all of a sudden. And I think he began to sort of rethink his strategy on that. And they had a clear the air meeting in the end with May. But you can see how the seeds there for an unhappy tour were very much established. I mean, you know, you don't really laugh that off very easily when you're then down under for 6 months with May, and there was friction, and it was an unhappy tour on a number of levels. But I always think the stranding by the side of the road story is an important one, because you know, you have these situations where people form opinions, or they form prejudices, or they get an impression about something, but there's usually a specific incident that sends it over the edge. And, you know, makes it more dramatic. And I think in Laker's case, it was the stranding by the roadside incident that really irritated him.
So Laker was effectively banned by Surrey, wasn't he? To the extent that they withdrew his entrance pass. So he had, if he went there, he had to pay entrance into the ground. He got the wrong side of MCC. Eventually, he actually went to Essex and played for nothing as an amateur.
That's
So
right. Yeah.
here he is, the anti-amateur, if you like, reinventing himself as one, because he still wanted to play cricket.
It's ironic, yeah, that he ended up as an amateur. But I think what happened there was he had, let's just say, he had a convivial evening with Trevor Bailey. And this would have been in 61, maybe early 62, but they had a few drinks. And I think during the course of this evening, Trevor mooted the idea that Laker might come to Essex for a few matches. And Jim either said, well, maybe, or it's not a bad idea, but he wasn't clear about yes or no, but he didn't shoot it down. And he said, the next thing I knew was I read in the Daily Express that I'd signed for Essex. So he claimed that there was a missing conversation there. I don't know if he was doing that, as he said that with a straight face, but he did have a poker face, Jim. So maybe there was a degree of irony, but he always claimed that Trevor sort of jumped the gun by announcing this to the press before they'd had a chance to sit down and work it out. So anyway, he did play for Essex for a couple of years.
And that worked well. And similarly, there was life for Tony Locke after Surrey. What wasn't there? Notably in Australia, with Western Australia, where he led them for several seasons, with Leicestershire here, where he took us to second place in the championship, I think. And there was one match that was rained off or whatever. Leicestershire could have won the championship last year. He was on the balcony and said, "I'm coming back next year. We're going to win the championship." Great response from the members here, but of course he didn't return, but he did carry on in Australia there, where he, in both places, he did demonstrate extraordinary powers of very distinctive idiosyncratic leadership, didn't he?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think it was just a money thing with Leicestershire. They offered it. I mean, you think of the money now, it's ludicrous, really, but it was something like £3,000, and he wanted 3,300, I think. And it was on that order. It might even have been less. You think about that. Think about that today, and it's ludicrous. But he did, as you say, went to Western Australia and had a fantastic Indian summer. Was it 7 or 8 years? It was something like that, but it was throughout the 60s, basically. Now, the interesting thing was his first winter out for Western Australia was 62, 63. And the significance of that was it was Ted Dexter's England tour of Australia was that same winter. And Tony had not been selected, and very controversially. And the irony is he then ended up in Australia anyway. And of course, the two factions met. And I'm indebted to my late great friend John Murray, who incidentally a bench was inaugurated in his honor at Lord's just the other day. I'm pleased to say was installed in, I think it's the Harris Garden. But JT said that the MCC team had been walking across the practice area at Perth prior to playing Western Australia, and here comes Tony Locke in the other direction, who's playing for Western Australia. Now, Ted Dexter, with that air of, of casual sort of insouciance that was one of his hallmarks, Ted saw Tony Locke and he said, "Oh, Tony, fantastic." He flipped him the ball, threw him the ball, and he said, "Will you come bowl at us in the nets? You know, we could use a net bowler." And JT said that the ball that came back nearly decapitated Dexter. Tony threw the ball back with probably an epithet or two added, and he said Ted had to move pretty sharpish to avoid having his head removed by the return ball, because Tony was not going to be used as a net bowler by the MCC or anyone else, particularly after they just, declined to have him on their tour. So that was perhaps tactless on Ted's part to suggest that, but it was nearly a case of the England captain being struck down by one of his discarded bowlers, but he got out of the way just in time.
Yeah.
But Tony had a fantastic, you could argue the last 7 or so years of his career were his most successful. And he was more Australian than some of the Aussies. One of them told me, could have been Dennis Lilly even, in the sense that he was, very always sort of at them, always, let's get these buggers and they're down now, let's not ease up, let's finish them off tonight, and very aggressive, as we've said. And he was sort of a natural Australian who somehow had grown up in the Surrey countryside. But in some ways, I think Australia was his natural home, and of course that is where he made his home in the end, where he ended up dying, in fact. So it was his home from home.
Where late in life he had legal difficulties, which perhaps reflected his character. I mean, reading your book, it seemed to me as if Tony Locke, he was manic, he was depressive, he was highly strung. It seems to me that he probably had some undiagnosed mental health conditions. Is that your view too?
Yeah, it's hard to say, to speculate on that, but there were some slightly strange reactions he had in life. One of the things he did, to his credit, I think, was he was an early pioneer of girls and women's cricket, and when it was not, very fashionable. And there's evidence that he would coach young women and give them net practice, and also usually on a volunteer basis. And I don't think there's any sense of impropriety in any of those relationships. But was it Godfrey who said that there was a bit of nudging of ribs in the England dressing room? Because he said at the end of most test matches, they go downstairs to the back of the pavilion, get in their cars, and there was always a sort of teenage girl, sometimes with her parents, sometimes waiting for Tony. And they say, well, this is, in the 50s. This was considered a bit odd. And I think in those days there was a bit of nudging going on in the drain. Who knows what sort of comments were made? But there's evidence that he was completely on the level in that sense, and was just helping out. And he saw women's cricket as a legitimate thing to be encouraged, and that he gave his best interest. What happened eventually in his home in Perth is a matter of some dispute still, but we know that he was found. There were 2 separate incidents. In the first one, a jury found him not guilty, and in the second one, they were hung. They couldn't come to a decision, and the state authority dismissed the charges. By that time, poor Tony was mortally ill with cancer, and his wife Audrey had passed away recently, and it was obviously a terribly sad ending. And he gave an untypically sort of self-pitying, very untypical interview in which he said, it's a pity that I'll now be remembered only as a sort of sex predator and not as a great cricketer. And I read this, I was here in the States, and I remember reading this, and I immediately wrote him a letter as the only form of communication, saying this is not true, and you will be remembered as a great cricketer. And I don't know if he got it, and if he did, it was a tiny consolation. But I hope that other people were saying that to him as well, because I think his reputation does transcend that very, very unfortunate ending it